I still remember the exact second he dismissed me, not because he raised his voice, not because he insulted me directly, but because he didn't even look up. I was standing there, chart in my hands, heart already racing, and he waved me off like I was background noise, like I was something in the room that existed only to pass supplies and stay quiet. And in that moment, something in my gut twisted so hard it felt physical. That's the part people don't talk about, how intuition doesn't come as a whisper. It comes as pressure, as weight, as fear. I've been a nurse long enough to know the difference between anxiety and instinct. Anxiety is loud and chaotic. Instinct is calm, terrifyingly calm, like a voice that doesn't ask for permission. And that voice was screaming at me. I wish I could say this was my first time being dismissed by a doctor. It wasn't. It happens more than anyone wants to admit. But this time was different. This time, the stakes felt heavier, even though nothing on the monitors looked dramatic. No alarms, no flashing lights, no obvious crisis. Just a patient who didn't feel right, and a doctor who thought I was overreacting. When I first walked into the room, I noticed it immediately. The patient was talking, responsive, even joking a little. Anyone doing a quick pass would have thought, stable. That word gets thrown around too easily. Stable doesn't mean safe. Stable just means nothing has exploded yet. I introduced myself, checked vitals, asked routine questions. Everything sounded fine on paper, but his eyes kept drifting. Not in a confused way, in a searching way. Like he was trying to anchor himself to something invisible. When I touched his wrist to feel his pulse, it wasn't just the rate that caught my attention. It was the quality. Weak, slippery, like it didn't want to be caught. That's when my stomach dropped. I asked him a simple question, one I'd asked hundreds of times before. He answered, but it took just a fraction too long, not enough to trigger protocols, enough to trigger me. I stepped out and found the doctor, presented the facts, calm, professional. I didn't dramatize. I never do. Nurses learn quickly that if you sound emotional, you lose credibility instantly. He skimmed the chart, nodded once, and said, "He's fine. Let's not create problems where there aren't any." That sentence still echoes in my head. Let's not create problems. As if noticing something wrong somehow causes it. As if silence keeps people safe. I stood there for a second longer than I should have. Long enough for him to glance at me again, irritation flickering across his face. "Anything else?" he asked. I almost said no. That's the dangerous part. The almost. There's a moment every nurse knows. The moment when you feel the pressure to fall back into line, to respect hierarchy, to not be that nurse, the one who questions, the one who pushes. I've seen what happens to those nurses. They get labeled, difficult, dramatic, emotional. But I've also seen what happens when we stay quiet. I went back into the room, telling myself I'd reassess. Maybe I was wrong. I wanted to be wrong. Being wrong would have meant everything stayed simple. But nothing got simpler. The patient's voice was softer now. His jokes had stopped. He asked me if the room felt colder than before. It didn't. But he was shivering. I checked again. Numbers still didn't scream, but they whispered. And whispers are more dangerous than screams because they're easy to ignore. I felt my heart start to pound, not with panic, but with clarity. That terrifying calm again. When I realized what might be happening, my first emotion wasn't fear. It was anger. Anger that I knew this story, that I'd seen this pattern before, that I could already imagine the chart review later, the quiet head shakes, the if only we had caught it sooner. I left the room again and found the doctor a second time. This time, he sighed before I even spoke. That hurt more than anything else. I explained what I was seeing. Not just numbers, but changes. Subtle ones. The kind that don't show up on a screen. The kind you learn by being at bedsides for years. He cut me off. "I understand your concern," he said, and I knew instantly he didn't. But clinically, there's nothing to justify escalation. Escalation. Such a clean word for something so messy. I nodded. Walked away. Did my job. But inside, something broke. Because when you know, you know. And pretending you don't doesn't make it go away. It just delays the impact. Back in the room, the patient looked at me and asked, "Am I okay?" That question should be illegal. Patients ask it with such hope, such trust. Like your answer can protect them. I told him I was there, that I was watching closely, that we'd take care of him. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. What scared me most wasn't what was happening in his body. It was what was happening in the system around him. Time passed in strange fragments. Minutes stretched. Sounds dulled. I kept checking, rechecking, documenting, recalculating. I could feel the tension crawling up my spine. Then something shifted. Not dramatically. No alarms. Just a change in his breathing. Slightly faster, slightly shallower. That's when I knew. I didn't ask permission this time. I acted. I called for what I needed. I raised my voice just enough to cut through the room. Suddenly, people were paying attention. Suddenly, the air felt different. The doctor came back, annoyed, clearly expecting to prove a point. He didn't look at me. He looked at the patient. And I watched his expression change. Not panic, not fear. Recognition. The kind that arrives a few seconds too late. I won't describe everything that followed in detail. Not because it was graphic, but because it was intense in a way that leaves marks you can't see. Orders were given, monitors changed, the room filled with movement and urgency. And in the middle of all that chaos, I felt something strange. Relief. Not because I was right, but because I hadn't stayed quiet. Later, much later, when the hallway was empty again and the adrenaline drained out of my body, the doctor finally spoke to me. He didn't apologize. He just said, "Good catch." 2 words. They didn't feel like enough. But they mattered. Because being dismissed hurts. Being doubted hurts. But being silent hurts more. That night, driving home, I replayed everything. Every moment where I almost backed down. Every second where fear tried to disguise itself as professionalism. And I realized something that still guides me now. Being a nurse isn't about following orders. It's about holding the line between what's written and what's real. And sometimes, being right doesn't feel victorious. Sometimes it just feels heavy. I didn't sleep when I got home that night. Not because of the noise or the adrenaline. Those fade. It was the quiet that kept me awake. The kind of quiet where your mind replays everything you didn't say out loud. I kept thinking about how close I came to letting it go. How easily this story could have ended differently. Not with drama, not with a headline, just with paperwork and regret. The most dangerous outcomes are often the quiet ones. The ones that slip through cracks without anyone noticing until it's too late to matter. The next shift, I walked back into that unit with a strange mix of confidence and vulnerability. Confidence because I trusted myself more than I had before. Vulnerability because now I knew exactly how alone that trust can feel. The patient was still there. Improved. Awake. Talking more clearly. When he saw me, his face softened in a way that made my chest tighten. "You were right," he said. Just like that. He didn't know the full story. He didn't know how many layers stood between what I felt and what actually happened. But somehow, that made it more meaningful. I smiled, told him he did the hard part. But inside, something shifted again. Because it wasn't about being right. It never is. It's about being heard before being right becomes the only option left. The doctor passed me in the hallway later. We exchanged professional nods. Nothing more. That's how these things usually end. No big moment. Just a quiet reset, like it never happened. But it did happen, and it stayed with me. I started noticing things after that. Patterns. The way certain voices carried more weight in rounds. The way concerns sounded different depending on who voiced them. The subtle hesitation nurses develop before speaking up. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much to be ignored again. There's a cost to that. It's from long hours or emotional strain. Those matter. But the real damage comes from being trained to doubt your own perception. From being taught, over and over, that your experience matters less than someone else's authority. That's a dangerous lesson. I caught myself hesitating one afternoon weeks later. Different patient, different situation, same feeling in my gut. For a second I froze, and that scared me more than anything that had happened before. How easy it would be to unlearn my own instincts. How quickly one dismissal can echo into the future, making you quieter than you should ever be. That's when I made a decision. A quiet one. Just for myself. I promised I wouldn't confuse respect with silence anymore. Respect doesn't mean shrinking. Professionalism doesn't mean disappearing. Being a nurse means standing at the intersection of human fragility and medical precision, and choosing to protect the human every time. Since then, I've had others roll their eyes. I've been praised and dismissed, sometimes in the same shift. But I no longer measure my worth by their reactions. I measure it by the moments when my presence mattered, even if no one ever wrote it down. What stays with me most isn't the tension or the confrontation. It's the look on that patient's face when someone finally took him seriously. That look is why I stay. That look is why I speak. Look away anymore. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Being right doesn't always feel powerful. Sometimes it feels lonely. Sometimes it feels like standing still while the world rushes past you, hoping someone will stop and listen. But I would rather be lonely for a moment than silent forever, because silence is comfortable, and comfort has never saved anyone. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening all the way to the end. Probably realize. If this resonated with you, if you've ever trusted your instincts when no one else did, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps stories like this keep finding their way into the light.